Hi, everybody. Welcome to the nationwide prayer campaign to end abortion forever. We're having Mike Bourgeois today, and he's going to be talking about a personhood and abortion. And I'm Karen, as you know, Karen Jobson at John Leaps. So let's get started with the prayers. He is a 1972 graduate of the LSU School of Journalism with a major in news editorial and advertising. 35 hours of his credits towards graduation were attained at the University of Maryland in Heidelberg, Germany, while stationed there on special assignment in the U.S. Army in 1969 to 1970. He was selected charter president of the LSU chapter of the ADS National Professional Advertising Society. Upon graduation, he became Public Information Director for the United Way in Baton Rouge and then became Public Information Director for the United Way of the Greater New Orleans area. Relocating to Baton Rouge, he became the Communications Director for the LA Department of Economic Development, then the LA Department of Transportation and Development before retiring in May 2004. Since retiring, he found a public information counseling business and does pro bono research work and public relations work for various pro-life individuals and organizations, with a special focus on the connection between the multi-billion-dollar legalized U.S. abortion industry and its shielding of pedophiles and potential sex slave traffickers. 72 years young, he and his wife have been married 42 years and have 3 daughters, 6 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. I welcome you. Thank you for coming on, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Let me just make you a little, okay. We can hear you now. Okay. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'll let you get going, and you're going to be speaking on personhood and abortion.
Okay. To preface a little bit before I get into it, I would like people to always keep in mind that nothing that is going on in our country and the world today just all of a sudden popped up out of nowhere. It's on a continuum that's been going on for decades, and it will continue to go on unless we put an end to it. So I want to talk about some information from a man named Dr. Mark Courret. And let me read you his bio because it's very interesting. This was written in 1995, and he was in Australia at the time. I was born and nurtured in a traditional and elitist environment in which classical, liberal, religious, and Asian values intermingled. The importance of integrity and individual responsibility, concern for human suffering and problems, and the vision of human interaction under divine inspiration as the basis for the establishment of a better world were the ideas that were put before me in my formative years. I embraced socialist and progressivist ideas while at university. Socialist and progressivist ideas based on concern for human problems led me to question seriously and reject any of the values and institutions of my early education and home environment. I felt they were not conducive to the confrontation of and solution to human problems and suffering. Socialist and progressivist ideas took a deep hold on me for about 12 years. While studying at Cambridge, I opposed the Vietnam War and was involved in the anti-war propaganda. I came to believe that the Soviet Union was being unjustly and overly criticized, and I was cynical about anti-Soviet propaganda. I was interested and involved in the political struggles of Sri Lanka, which is where he was, where he got into the Socialist Party. I supported the Socialist Constitution and was the chief intellectual apologist for it. I was, however, a continuing critic of the socialist government in Sri Lanka, pointing out the deep gulf between theory and practice. The consequence was that the possibility of political victimization necessitated my leaving Sri Lanka, socialist Sri Lanka. I arrived in Australia, a refugee from Sri Lankan socialism without a penny in my pocket, and was compelled to make a new start in an unknown country. While I was a socialist, I took socialism seriously, as they all do. I had struggles with my conscience in purchasing a family home, becoming a property owner, and receiving inherited property. On deeper reflection and experience, I have found socialism and progressivism wanting. I have come to believe that socialism and progressivism are, in practice, as far as human development is concerned, retrogressive philosophies. I have been committed at various times to socialism and progressivism, and also to the liberal tradition. Though this process of thought and through this process of thought and experience, I have come to appreciate the evolved values of Western civilization. Socialist and progressivist ideas, which influenced me at one time, have been influential in the refinement of my liberal values. So he found out that, hey, you can be for the socialists and even help them come to power. But when they get in power, they sold you a bag of goods that just the practice of it is just not what they promised. And so he wrote a one-page treatise, which I find remarkable because it gives you an overall view of how socialists and progressivists operate. And it's called Law and Morality, the Judeo-Christian and Moral Values. A pastor informed his congregation that Christians can no longer seek to impose their moral values on a society which no longer accepts Christianity. The second part of the statement is false. Church membership and attendance has sharply decreased. However, the Australian Value Study demonstrated that 80% believe in God, 75% regard themselves as Christians. There are some who forcibly and aggressively argue that Christian values must be exorcised like demons from the law, society, and politics. Gareth Evans, now Senator Gareth Evans, is reported in the Sydney Morning Heralds on the 7th of May, 1976, page 11, as stating at a convention of the South Australian Council for Civil Liberties that children wanted a right to sexual freedom and education, and quotes, protection from the influences of Christianity. The same article referred to Mr. Richard Neville of Oz as stating, quotes, promiscuity is one beneficial way of breaking up the family structure, which has led children to become the property of their parents. Professor Manning Clark described the late Justice Murphy as a man who, quotes, believed passionately that the morality of Judeo-Christianity had ceased to be relevant. I see Lionel Murphy as a man who, in that context, strove to end the dominion by God over human beings. If law is not based on reality, on morality, on what can it be based? There's no justification for any law that is not based on a moral or ethical value. Those who argue that Christian morality must be exorcised from law and society are at the same time arguing for new laws based on their preferred particular moral base. That's exactly how abortion became legal here, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. They are guilty of double standards. The pastor who made the statement that above has been deceived and is blissfully unaware of the, quotes, new morality, which the opponents of morality are committed to. Relativism, secular humanism, these sound familiar? Permissiveness, situational ethics, anti-Christianityism, material equality, and distributive justice enforced through law. Many concerned people, including Christians, are drawn into the war against moral values without realizing what is happening. The supporters of the new morality focus on particular human problems, excite compassion, and are able to hide their underlying philosophy and perspectives. They also confuse ethical standards of honesty and respect for private property with the taboos of social morality. They are adept at the characterization of morality. And I might add that they do that all the time. It's not a baby. It's a fetus. It's a collection of cells. And on and on. Marriage is not just between a man and a woman. And they just keep redefining everything to suit themselves and their own moral values and say that Christians should just stay the heck out of it. Christian morality underlies the common law, British common law, which our legal system is based on here too. The common law inherited by the British colonies in Australia and by the Commonwealth established in 1901 was developed over many centuries by British judges reacting to particular human situations on the basis of Christian values. So our legal system is based on Christian values the same way that Sharia law is based on Islam. So the Christian moral values, which were influential in the development of the common law, are similar to the values of other great religions. Thus, though the common law was consciously developed on Christian principles, its base may be found in principles of morality, which are common to the messages of all the great religions. The basic issue is whether law based on the basic morality common to all major religions is to be defended, or movement toward a law based on ideas of material equality and influenced by Marxist philosophy is to continue. Now, when I'm going to read you some information here that was printed in Voice Crying in the Wilderness. And it says, Chris Vanescu reminds us not to forget Alexander Solzhenitsyn's penetrating analysis of the decline of Western culture. And probably most people listening to me already forgot. Alexander who? It was the gulags where he received the critical insight that the line between good and evil rests in the heart of every man. Sanctification or holiness, to use the translated Greek, begins within. Healing of culture first begins with interior repentance, the changing of the mind, the clearing of conscience, the putting off of sin. And from there, the healing salve of the love of God begins to enter the darkened world and renew it. He goes on, let's say. So he wrote, this is what he said. He was one of the great moralists of the 20th century. And you should read any of his works like Gulag Archipelago, because when he started talking against communism, that's where he wound up for years. He wrote this short piece that's titled, Men Have Forgotten God. More than a half century ago, while I was a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offering the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all of this has happened to us, they said. Since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of that ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, like abortion has swallowed up some 60 million of our people here in the United States, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened to us. And when you think of the Soviet communists, they were said to be, they say, well, the socialists are different. They're not communists. The communists are the bad guys. That's what we're saying here. Well, that is misguided, because communism is the name of the political party. Socialism is the form of government that it undertakes. Recall, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was the USSR. It wasn't the Union of Socialist Communist Republics. They were the same socialist as Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party now champion. I remember watching black and white TV when Premier Nikita Khrushchev banged his shoe on the podium in the United Nations and said to the United States, "We will bury you." At which point people were saying, "Oh my God, he's threatening nuclear war." But they forgot the last part. And that was, and we are going to do it, and we won't even have to fire a shot, because you are going to fall from within. And apparently we've been doing everything we possibly finish with Solzhenitsyn. What is more, the events of the Russian Revolution can only be understood now, at the end of the century, against the background of what has since occurred in the rest of the world. What emerges here is a process of universal significance. And if I were called upon to identify briefly the principal trait of the entire 20th century, here too, I would be unable to find anything more precise and pithy than to repeat once again, men have forgotten God. The failings of human consciousness, deprived of its divine dimension, have been a determining factor in all the major crimes of this century, the 20th century. The first of these was World War I, and much of our present predicament can be traced back to it. It was a war, the memory of which seems to be fading and almost forgotten, when Europe was bursting with health and abundance, fell into a rage of self-mutilization. Well, what does that sound like today here? We had the greatest economy ever. We were bursting with health and abundance. And then coronavirus hit, and all of the anarchists and everybody else started falling into a rage of self-mutilation. They even got rid of the statues of the abolitionists. They wanted to get rid of statues of Mary and Jesus. You see, we are no different as people than people in any other country. If we do what they did, it's going to happen to us. One of the definitions of insanity is do things the way they've been done and expect a different result. That's not going to happen. Okay, so the only possible explanation for this war is a mental eclipse among the leaders of Europe due to their lost awareness of a supreme power above them. Remember a couple of years ago at the Democratic National Convention where they booed God? And we've been throwing God out of every place in society and government that we can think of. So only a godless embitterment could have moved ostensibly Christian states to employ poison gas, a weapon so obviously beyond the limits of humanity. And I remember, I like Dr. Sebastian Gorka a lot. I have one thing, though, that I will disagree with him on. He said, to liberals, reality is optional. Dr. Gorka, please, that's way too kind. To liberals, reality is an enemy that must be defeated for them to get into power. The unjust decisions still haunts us. Surprisingly, we re-legalized this discredited personhood litmus test in 1973 when Roe v. Wade declared humans in the womb aren't legal persons and they have no rights and they can be aborted on demand. Some even referred to those in the womb as a collection of cells. Others who profess not to believe in abortion, but in a person's right to choose, are like those who didn't believe in owning slaves, but in the right of others to choose to own them if they wanted to. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a lady who said that she was the head of the pro-life movement when she was a student in college. And so, okay, I thought, well, all right, this is a pro-life woman. So I said, well, it's amazing to me that Christians think that they can straddle the fence by saying, I'm not really pro-abortion, I'm pro-choice. Well, what you're saying when you say that you are pro-choice is, personally, I would not have an abortion. But I think everybody else in America should be free to choose if they want to have an abortion or not. So I don't call pro-life on the part of one person, and pro-abortion on the part of the other 350 million is pro-life at all. So then I said, so she says, well, I've heard that argument and I don't totally agree with it. So then I said, well, what about if somebody said, well, personally, I would never own a slave, but I think slavery should be legal for everybody else who wants to own one or more. And I said, doesn't that kind of tell you that maybe there are some rights that we shouldn't have the right to choose to do? And they should be outlawed. And she said, no, that doesn't tell me anything like that. So,
well, another way of looking at it is, if they don't want to have an abortion, they're pro-choice, but that other people can. That you could say, oh, you don't want to commit murder, but other people can commit murder. You know, so they're not defining it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, let me fast forward to this then, because people say that, you know, there's nothing in the Bible that says that abortion is wrong, and it only alludes to it like, I knew you before I knit you in your mother's womb. So I looked it up on CatholicLink.org. The headline says, what did early Christians have to say about abortion in 50 AD? And this comes from a document called the Didache, Didache. And what it says is, you shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill what is begotten. And the Didache is also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations. And it was written in the first century, in the first day of the first century AD. It's a brief, anonymous early Christian treatise written in Koine Greek, dated by modern scholars to the first century. The first line of this treatise is, the teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles, or nations, by the 12 apostles. The Didache is considered the first example of the genre of church orders. The Didache reveals how Jewish Christians saw themselves and how they adopted their practice for Gentile Christians. The Didache is similar in several ways to the Gospel of Matthew, perhaps because both texts originated in similar communities. The opening chapters, which also appear in other early Christian texts, are likely derived from an earlier Jewish source. The Didache is considered part of the group of second-generation Christian writings known as the Apostolic Fathers. The work was considered by some church fathers to be part of the New Testament, while being rejected by others as spurious or non-canonical. So in the end, and this is where you make your own decision as to whether you think this has any credence, it was not accepted in the New Testament canon. However, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with a broader canon, includes the Didascalia, a work which draws on the Didache. Lost for centuries, a Greek manuscript of the Didache was rediscovered in 1873, and a Latin version of the first 5 chapters was discovered in 1900. So Yeah, the church has taught for a long time that killing babies in the womb is murder.
Yeah.
And that, causing an abortion through, of an embryo through abortifacient drugs or something that they made from some of these weeds at the time was also called murder. So we are in a lot of trouble these days because we are doing lots of wrong, and it affects everything. You see, when if you look at abortion in the ancient pagan Roman Empire, the state religion of Rome was paganism. There were several Roman, the pantheon of gods that they had. And under the pagan religion, the state religion of ancient Rome, pagan Rome, abortion was legal, infanticide was legal. And the decision to have the abortion was the decision of the father, and the mother could say nothing about it. And if the baby was, a year or two old and Papa got tired of feeding it, you just throw it outside the city gates and let the animals have it. And if you tried to rescue it, you better not get caught. And pedophilia, bestiality, every sexual orientation and practice conceivable were tenets of pagan religion, the state religion of Rome. So when the Christianity became the religion of Rome, the Christian Roman emperors criminalized all of those behaviors. That's why they were talking about abortion right there in the Didache, because they were trying to wean these Christians away from those pagan practices. And so by the end of the 300s AD, all of those things were criminalized. The Christian Roman Emperor Constantius II criminalized pagan same-sex marriage on December the 14th, 342 AD. When you don't remember history, you repeat it. I'm sorry. So abortion stayed illegal in the West until 1920, when Vladimir Lenin legalized all forms of abortion in the atheistic Soviet Union in 1920. The same year he drove the Catholic Church underground and criminalized it. And so what happens after that? The Brits say, oh man, we can't let those commies be, more progressive than we are. So Britain legalized abortion for its ostensibly Christian women in 1967. And so then I remember between 67 and 73, because I graduated from high school in 65, when all hell broke loose all over the place. And I remember people saying, that'll never happen here. This is the United States. There's no way abortion will ever be legalized in this country. We're better than that. Well, ha, ha, ha. We're not better than anybody. We're not better than anybody. We have the same fallen nature anybody else has. Now, like Dr. Courre was saying, the way we legalized abortion was that, and women over here were saying, well, wait a minute, this is not fair to us. we can't have an abortion here. We gotta fly or travel all the way to Europe to be able to have an abortion, and that's just not fair. So, in Roe v. Wade, the Harry Blackman, Justice Blackman, wrote the majority Roe v. Wade opinion, and in that opinion, he said several interesting things. One is, he said, now you hear everybody today say that Roe v. Wade is settled law and it's a constitutional right of women. Wrong, wrong. Here's why. He admitted himself, there is no right to privacy in the Constitution, in the Constitution, that that allows somebody the right to privacy to have an abortion. But we sense that there's a penumbra surrounding the Constitution that justifies it. Well, that is the granddaddy of all cases of going outside the four corners of the page. And the justices are just as ignorant of what goes on around the Constitution as they are of a whole lot of other things, because they call that a penumbra surrounding the Constitution, and a penumbra is a term for the corona-like haze that you see around a planet when viewed through a telescope. Well, back at that time when, what's his name, that doctor was the guru, tune in, turn on, and drop out, I'm sure that if these justices were doing what their guru said, they saw Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze around the Constitution and everything else that they looked at. And so you had a situation there where the Supreme Court legalized something not in the Constitution as though it were in the Constitution, based on a figment of their imagination that doesn't even exist around the Constitution. Furthermore, he said, well, so here's the deal that we have. Here's the other problem we have. No two churches and no two individuals can determine the point at which life begins. Some say at conception, some say at quickening, and all sorts of other, the full moon or whatever. They had all kind of different thoughts about when life began. So he said, because nobody can determine the point at which life begins, and we're not capable of determining that, we are going to err on the side of creating this new right out of thin air. And that's the only multi-billion-dollar industry that the Supreme Court ever created just on its own. And now it sucked up the whole country and our society and everything else. So he said, however, and this is what nobody wants to believe, but it's in there. He said, however, if the suggestion of personhood is ever, just the suggestion of it is ever established, that, quotes, collapses Roe v. Wade and, quotes, guarantees all 14th Amendment rights under the Constitution to those in the womb from conception that those outside the womb enjoy. Well, friends, 1984 was a long time ago. But that was the year, 11 years after Roe v. Wade, that DNA fingerprinting was invented. And DNA fingerprinting proves, it doesn't just suggest, it proves life begins at conception, when at that instant, the DNA in the egg and the DNA in the sperm instantly recombine, and a new creature is formed with its own individual and unique DNA profile forever. If it lives 10 days in the womb or 100 years outside the womb, it's never going to be any more intrinsically human as it is at that point. But don't worry about that. They're not legal persons. So anyway, that's what the court says. So then you have people like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and other supposedly conservative-leaning people that said, both of them said at their confirmation hearings that Roe v. Wade is settled law. Okay. Roe v. Wade legalized on the basis of a non-existing haze around the Constitution a new right to privacy. But Roe v. Wade also re-legalized the precedent that was set in 1857 with the Roe v. Wade and with the Dred Scott decision. So how can a decision, why is that called a decision? And Roe v. Wade is called an opinion. An opinion doesn't sound like anything settled to me. And so in the Dred Scott decision, it said, quotes, enslaved Africans in America have no rights because they're not legal persons, which is what Reverend Wright, Obama's minister at the time, was talking about when he condemned it. And so how did something so damnable as denial of personhood to black people on the plantation become such a wonderful, warm and fuzzy women's right in our day? It just re-legalized that. Now, the Supreme Court never even apologized for Dred Scott. And they never did reverse it. It took nothing less than the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the adoption of the 14th Amendment to do away with that incredibly unjust decision. So the Supreme Court's learning curve is about as flat as the heartbeat line on a dead baby's heart monitor. They redid it again, and they even expanded upon it. So we have Roe v. Wade is the solution to its own collapse. It is conditional. It was conditioned on the suggestion of personhood, which has been established since 1984. So Roe v. Wade was collapsed scientifically in 1984. People have been, the Innocence Project has freed people from death sentences since then in every place of confinement except the human womb. And so here's another thing. Here's how it affects everything. This is from LifeSite News, 2016. Martin Luther King's niece, Alveda King, said, "If Black lives matter, they matter in the womb too." nobody cares. Well, we do, but not a whole lot of people care. So the Supreme Court says babies in the womb can be killed because they're not legal persons. So here's a piece in a paper called "Constitutional Rights of Firms." How corporations use the Constitution to expand their economic power. And this was June the 19th, 2020, not that long ago. Since 1976, corporations have been expanding their rights. They've become entities whose rights are protected by the U.S. Constitution. That gives them a legal status like of U.S. citizens. Am I going over time?
Yes. So we'll wrap it up in after you're done with that thought.
Okay. As a result, they've increased their political and economic power. In various cases, the Supreme Court has granted corporations some of the same constitutional rights as citizens. So corporations have personhood. We've got an orangutan in the zoo in Florida that was granted personhood by Judge Elena Liberatori in her landmark ruling. You know, that's what they call Roe v. Wade, a landmark ruling. In 2015, declared that Sandra, the orangutan, is legally not an animal, but a person, thus entitled to the same legal rights enjoyed by people and better living conditions. Ruling, I wanted to tell society something new, that animals are sentient beings and that the first right they have is our obligation to respect them. But we don't have to respect babies in the womb. So anyway, I get kind of fired up with this. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. We appreciate your speaking. God bless you, Mike.
And you too.
Thank you.